Welcome to the recorded lecture, The Occupational Therapy Process, Chapter 10 of your Solomon and O'Brien text. The resource for this lecture is the Solomon and O'Brien text, Chapter 10. However, I have referenced information from the Occupational Therapy Association Practice Framework. At the end of this lengthy PowerPoint, you should be able to explain the difference between a frame of reference and a model of practice and identify different models of practice or frames of reference that can be used in pediatrics, how assessment leads us through the intervention process. You should be able to understand developing long-term and short-term goals and understanding the entire OT process. And that as a profession, we are family-centered, culturally diverse, that it's important during the OT process that we use therapeutic use of self and activity analysis. So I hope you are interested in what's going to come in the following slides. So throughout the OT process, OTs and OTAs are both involved. However, their role is different. The occupational therapist or the registered therapist is the individual who will select the assessment for the evaluation process, interpret the results, and lead in developing the intervention plan. The certified occupational therapy assistant is the individual who can gather data under the supervision of the occupational therapist, who can contribute to the intervention plan, and who often is the individual who is implementing intervention. This chart is from your textbook on page 175. So if you want to see it larger, I suggest you turn to page 175 or you open the PowerPoint in full screen mode. So what is the process? You guys should know this. And we're just going to do a quick review. It's referral, evaluation, intervention plan, intervention, and then discharge planning. We're talking about the roles of the practitioner here. So in the referral process, the OTR is the individual who receives the referral. If the CODA is given the referral, they should pass it along to the OTR. Once the OTR has the referral, and screening can occur at this point too, the OTR determines what type of evaluation, what kind of assessment tools is going to occur. They may, at this point in time, if the OTA is deemed service competent and proficient in administering some standardized assessments, they may delegate some of those standardized assessments to the OT assistant. Again, the OT assistant needs to be service competent. What happens after the evaluation? Well, the evaluation kicks out the intervention plan. And this is developed again under the occupational therapist, but the occupational therapy assistant can collaborate with the registered therapist to develop the intervention plan. Once the plan is in place, what happens? Well, the actual intervention. And the OTR carries out the intervention plan and supervises the OT assistant. As an OT assistant, you're going to participate in carrying out the intervention plan under the supervision and direction and in collaboration with the OTR. That means you are, and you're going to hear me say this over and over and over, you are the eyes and ears for the registered therapist. If you are the individual working directly with the client, you're the one in the know, and you have to share all that information for effective intervention. So if a parent has a concern, if you notice that the intervention plan or the child has achieved or is not achieving their goals, You share that with the OTR and supervision. Together, you make a wonderful intervention plan for successful outcomes. And then it's discharge planning. This is at the end of the intervention, so we can discharge if someone is plateaued and not making progress, or if they have achieved their goals, or if there's another instance that discharge is warranted. Say the parents don't want to come anymore, or people are moving, the discharge plan is in place. And the OTR is going to determine when the discharge is appropriate, and they're going to develop a discharge plan. What are you going to do as an occupational therapy assistant? Well, you're going to contribute your knowledge about what you know about the child, and you're going to collaborate with the discharge planning. So let's say someone's moving. You might say, hey, if they could get into an after school program or a Y, that would be really YMCA after school program or swimming lessons, that would really benefit the child. Um, you can make suggestions. You're going to be the person who knows the child well. And then there's a follow-up plan where the OTR is going to develop the plan and the scope of plan, and the OTA will collaborate in development with the process. Okay, I want to just add this for clarity. Where is this process defined? The referral, screening, evaluation, intervention, and discharge plan. Think about it. You are absolutely correct. In the OTPF4, the domain and process. As a practitioner in your future practice, if you are not sure what the process is, go to the occupational therapy practice framework. It is revised every 5 years, but the process doesn't change, just expansion on the definitions, maybe. Um, but where are you going to go? Where does the process come from? Our American Occupational Therapy Association. The document is the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework, Domain, and Process. Now I know you're clear. You know that the process, the OT process, comes from the practice framework. Good for you. So, what are we going to talk about models of practice for? Well, a model of practice gives us a scaffold, something to hang our thinking on when we're looking at assessment tools and intervention plans. They help us focus on specific factors, um, individual to the client, and to look at how those factors influence one's functioning. Models of practice essentially help us organize our thinking. They're based on theory, uh, everything, the models, the frames of reference, these are theories. They're scientific theories that someone proposes, they need to be tested, they're written up. And so our practice is built on theories. And they these models and practice that are models of practice that our profession chooses to utilize are typically written by occupational therapy practitioners, and they are in alignment with what? Oh, our OT process that comes from the OT practice framework. So, two takeaways: models of practice are different than frames of reference. Models of practice help us organize our thinking for when we're going to engage in the OT process. And the practice framework gives us the process. I hope that's clear. On the next few slides, we're briefly going to look at some examples of models of practice, which include MOHO, PEO, OA, the Canadian Model of Occupational Performance, and CAWA. The information from the next set of slides comes from table 10.1 on your text on page 157 if you would prefer to look at it in that format. So here we're going to talk about MOHO, which is a model of practice, which is the model of human occupation. And in this table, in these slides, you're going to see who the authors are. So Kill Hoffner, you're going to hear about him anytime anyone talks about MOHO. And what are the components of MOHO? Well, they look at volition, habituation, performance, and environment. And the premise, the thinking of this system is that, or this model of practice, is that the human is an open system. That means everything interacts, right? That volition drives the system, but all systems interact to form that person's occupational identity. And if the practitioner chooses to use MOHO, the clinician's role is to understand the client in terms of these systems and subsystems. So the text gives an example. Practitioners using Kill Hoffner's MOHO know that they're going to gather information about volition, which is the child or parent's goals and priorities or occupational choices. That they're going to look at habituation or routines, which is how the child spends the day. They're going to look at performance factors, and that's the child's physical skills and abilities. And no surprise, as occupational therapy practitioners, we always look at the environment, we look at context, and this is the physical layout of the home in this case. So here's one confusing thing, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but MOHO is so well developed that it also can be used as, sorry to do this to you, a frame of reference. And we're going to talk about frames of reference more, but MOHO can be used as both a model of practice and frame of reference because it's got so many intervention tools or intervention strategies and assessment tools. Sorry about that, but MOHO. Another model of practice was designed by the Canadian Occupational Therapy Association and a group of authors. It's called the Canadian Occupational Performance Model. And this can be used in pediatric practice. What are the components? What's the focus of this model of practice? Well, it's spirituality, occupation, and context. So in this model of practice, the worth of the individual is central to this model. So it's very client-centered. And they look at the fact that an individual spirituality is core to the person, and that we have to understand an individual's spirituality to facilitate engagement in occupations. And when you think of culture and just the underlying reason and purpose and how some activities are meaningful, you cannot take away the spirituality, right? So they believe that spirituality facilitates engagement in occupations and that the performance of occupations take place within a physical, a social, and different cultural environments. PEO. So this model of practice is the person environment occupational performance model, and it was designed by Mary Law and her peers. And it looks at what? Three things. Person, which is in terms of the physical, the social, and emotional factors. It looks at the environment, which are the contexts, the environment or contexts that influence a person. And finally, it looks at the occupation, the everyday things people do. And I want to go back because this is on my slide and I didn't say it. The environment also includes one's culture. Now I'm going to try to draw three circles here because when I think of this model, you will also often see this diagram that's associated with it. It's three circles. Bear with me, it's not so easy to do. I know it's not a perfect circle. So that would be the person. This would be the environment. And this is the occupation. And in this section is where we have the overlap of the three that we need to consider for occupational functioning. So what do we look at? Person, environment, occupation. Pretty easy, PEO. The Kawa model is a model of occupation. It was designed by Michael Iwama, and well, I don't need to go into his history. I didn't go into everybody else's history, but he designed the Kawa model. And it has these components. It has the riverbanks, rocks, and driftwood. And he likens one to the river. And the river represents life flow and an individual's priority. So picture a river going by. The river banks refer to the environment and context, both social and physical, that shape the flow. And then there are sometimes obstacles and challenges in our lives, and those are represented by rocks in the river. And the driftwood is the influencing factors of one's life. So this is a really unique, fun to use, interesting model of practice. I'm going to refrain from going into great detail here. But the Kawa model uses the client's narrative. So, what's the narrative? Their story. Where do we get their narrative? Through the occupational profile. By engaging them in an exercise to use a metaphor of a river, the different parts, to represent their past, their present, and their future experiences and needs. So it helps to get a big picture of the individual using this representation of a river, riverbanks, rocks, and driftwood. So a quick recap, what have we talked about so far? Well, we talked about the roles of an occupational therapy practitioner, the scope of practice that we work in. We talked about the occupational therapy practice framework that defines our domain and process, so our scope and areas that we work in. And then we talked about models of practice, which are ways to organize our thinking. And in this ending section of this part of chapter 10, we're going to talk about the OT process again. We're just going to go into it a little bit more. When we talked about it before, it was the roles of you as the roles of the practitioner. So here we go. The evaluation period. In the evaluation period is the screening. Who accepts the referral? The OTR accepts the referral. What would you do if you were a CODA and you're handed a referral? You pass it along to the OTR. The reasons for referral depend on the setting, on state licensure, laws, and regulations. Remember, legislation guides a lot of what we can do. Insurance supports the legislation. And so our scope of practice defines how we approach it as an occupational therapy practitioner. But these are all part of who we see and we don't see. There can be a variety of referral sources, but most frequently they are doctors or nurse practitioners. In school settings, they can be educators. The families can ask for a referral from a doctor, but the order in the medical setting will come from a doctor. What happens as an OTA? You are responsible for acknowledging a request and for forwarding that referral to your supervisor. Also, during the evaluation period is the screening process. Screenings give us a general overview. They're a quick peek. They're not an in-depth evaluation. They're in a school setting, an OT, an OTA might go in with an observation checklist into a classroom and observe a child, or in the classroom and in other settings. So the cafeteria, the art room, getting on and off the bus. So we get a big picture. The screening. It's going to determine if there's a need for a further evaluation. And that evaluation, under our scope, what are we going to look at? So is it a motor issue? Is it a perceptual issue? It's determined by the OT what kind of evaluation is done, or what kind of assessment tools are used. So the OT or the COTA can perform screenings. Again, you're going to be under the direction of the occupational therapist. Once the OTA has identified a need, and this is, of course, under collaboration with, so there would be a conversation. The OT is going to determine what assessment tools or what format is going to be used to complete the evaluation. So what happens first? A referral. Someone tells us, "Oh, this child should be evaluated." Then there's a screening. Oh, the practitioners look at the child. I'm talking about pediatrics here. So they look at the child in different areas, and they're going to determine, yeah, per the screening, I think this child would benefit from an evaluation to have a deeper look to see what's going on. So it's been determined through the referral and screening process that the child should have an assessment and evaluation. So the OTR is going to determine the type, and they can ask the occupational therapy assistant, who must be deemed service competent, to administer any standardized tests. What are they going to look at? Well, they're going to look at the areas of performance, the client factors, and the performance skills. So, in a pediatric setting, um, let's go to a school setting. They're going to look at what is impacting the child's ability to participate in education, what kind of client factors might be interfering, and what performance skills might be interfering with their ability to participate in education. If I think of this in a clinic based setting, maybe the child is referred for some um, inability to complete ADLs. So, what are they going to look at? They're going to look at the ADLs, what factors are influencing it, and how what performance skills. So, is it a motor skill? Is it a sensory processing skill that impacts the child's ability to complete those ADL tasks? Ultimately, and always, always, always remember, only the OTR can interpret results. That's OTAs cannot interpret results, and that's based on the education, the depth of education that an OTR has. So, and it is ultimately the responsibility of the OTR to develop an intervention plan. Can an OTA collaborate? Yes, but the OTR is going to interpret the results of the evaluation and then start to come up with an intervention plan. Part of the evaluation process is the occupational profile. Per our standards of practice, it is deemed that an occupational profile should be included in the evaluation process. They might look differently in every setting, but essentially, what are they going to gather in the occupational profile? Quick disclaimer here. AOTA has a very nice form for an occupational profile. Not everyone uses that specific form, but what are they going to be gathering at the beginning of the evaluation? Finding who is the client. Why is the client seeking services? What occupations and activities are the client or child successful in or having difficulties with? Contexts and environment. You remember that the context can be the physical, there's different contexts, right? And the environment, what location. So, how do the contexts and environment impact an individual's performance? We're going to look at the occupational history. And very importantly, we want to know who the client is, but we also want to know what their priorities are and targeted outcomes. This is right at the beginning. This is in the evaluation process that this occurs. In the evaluation process, the level of performance is determined for the client. And there are your text outlines different levels of performance, and functional independence is refers to the completion of age appropriate activities with or without the use of assistive devices and without human assistance. So eating with an offset spoon, reaching the sink with a little step stool. um, when you think of independent after setup. Assisted performance refers to when the child's participation in specific age appropriate tasks has some assistance of the caregiver. So maybe they can get up to the sink, but they're not able to complete the hand washing sequence, and they need someone to either use verbal cues or a level of assistance, such as hand over hand, to complete the task. And then dependent performance is when a child is unable to perform an age appropriate task, and the caregiver is required to perform the task for the child. So the text gives the example of the child not being able to feed themselves and the parent or caregiver holding the spoon for them, or the child not being able to wash their hands, so the parent has to do the entire sequence, or caregiver has to do the entire sequence. So 3 levels of performance: functional independence, assisted performance, and dependent performance. And you know that this isn't the end of the OT process right here, right? We've gotten the evaluation process that gives us the level of performance. After this, we're going to determine the intervention plan, then eventually reevaluation and discharge planning. For this PowerPoint section, I'm going to end here at the level of performance, and we'll pick up at intervention planning. Thanks for listening to part 1.